It's a very complex subject, and there are very many layers to fracking and the issues around fracking. But I'm going to focus on the health of humans, although we could stray into the health of animals if anybody would like to take me down that road. Some of the impacts on health in humans, particularly the sinus and nasal passages, for instance, and the breathing, are reflected in animal experience. But if anybody's interested in that, we'll talk about that in the questions. I've been busy with peer-reviewed science, and by that, a scientific article is presented to a magazine or a journal. It then goes out to colleagues who may or may not like you, may or may not want you to succeed. So they will look at it in great detail, pass it back to the author for adjustment. And so that is reviewed by the people who know most. I have, however, been informed by government reports and government studies, and one of the government studies from the House of Commons Environment Audit Committee, a cross-party committee, reported in March, I think, of this year, saying that we just don't know enough, and because there are issues and problems, we should have a moratorium. As you know, that didn't make much progress, unfortunately, during the time of the Infrastructure Act. It was booted into touch. So fracking. It's a new process. No matter what you're told, it is a very new process in the world. It only really came active any size in 2004-05, and it sort of took off only 10 years ago. We haven't had time really to do the science. We haven't known enough about it to do the science thoroughly. And some of the health issues will not have yet emerged. So you mentioned the cancers, leukemias, lymphomas and so on. They take years and years to show. A bit of wheezing shows up quite quickly. Cancers take a decade or more to show. So the science around fracking is slowly emerging. And what's been blocking our understanding of what the issues are? And in the US, where nearly all the fracking has taken place, the fracking companies, the oil and gas companies, have been exempted from these bits of legislation, which we would expect to be in place everywhere, and certainly in our country. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water, ground protection, so protecting your water sources, and the Community Right to Know Act. And that Community Right to Know Act covers doctors and scientists as well. It's very hard to get the evidence from the gas companies, from the Environmental Protection Agency, from government, from councils. And so that sort of set of obstacles has proven quite difficult to get any traction on what's going on. And in addition to that, we've had non-disclosure following compensation claims. So when you have something bad happen to you in America, and you've eventually had to go as far as the courtroom steps, they will settle out of court, give you a piece of paper to sign, which is a non-disclosure act. In other words, you can't tell anybody what's been going on, and then they seal the court documents, so nobody can investigate the bad things that happen in America. And so it's taken a very long time to get evidence. And there are families in America where not only the adults in the family have had non-disclosure orders placed on them, but the children have for the duration of their lifetime. They have an income stream which would be very comfortable, providing they don't talk to lawyers, the press, or anybody outside their family. The other things which are a bit difficult to penetrate are the industry denial, the industry spin, so they jump onto a report, say the EPA report on water, and they spin it to make it sound quite comfortable. There's no systemic risk to water. And both governments and companies are expedient in the face of evidence. And we've seen this with asbestos, with thalidomide, with lead in petrol, with tobacco, with diesel, and now with fracking. They're using the same principles, the same patterns of behaviour that all those industries had to support them in the face of concern and evidence. So let's go on to what we do know. And the science has taken off like this since the last 2-3 years, really, with 80% of the papers about the impacts of shale gas being published since 2013. And as a result of that sort of evidence, there have been moratoria now in New York State, Maryland, New Jersey, Vermont, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and brave little Tasmania. And briefly in the UK. And had that cross-party committee had its way, there would be a further moratorium in England, in Britain, until such time as we can really get our heads around the science. So what do we know? The whole system of gas extraction leaks. It leaks to the air from the wells that are drilled. From the drilling, from the fracking, to the condensers, the gas processing stations, the pumping stations, and the pipes. And some of those things we don't get told about are going to even exist. Huge, great, big pumping stations and whatever haven't been built into our consciousness about fracking. But it leaks. And does that really matter? Well, they spoilt the party by flying over fracking sites and sniffing the air. So instead of a computer model from the EPA, they've actually sniffed the air and found out what's in the air in America. And they've driven around the fracking sites and into the cities and found a huge loss of the most measurable gas, methane. And they reckon that about 7% of the production of the gas leaks to air. Now, methane doesn't really matter very much. It explodes, it burns, and so on. But the other gases that flow with it include the BTEX chemicals. That's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. And they are toxic. And benzene, there's no safe level of benzene. And it causes leukemia and lymphomas. Probably as a result of all this, children particularly are impacted. Now, why children? Well, they are more sensitive, they're growing fast, they're closer to the ground, they're always getting their hands in the earth and sticking their hands in their mouth. And one source of worry is that children are going to live for a long time. So if any of these problems are long-term impacts, they're going to be alive in 70 or 80 years, whereas I'm not. And the first people to get the impacts of this aren't going to be alive as the children will be. So what do the children get? They get intense nasal irritation, snot. Does that matter? But they then get daily nosebleeds. And that's really difficult and a nuisance. But it's not. But they get sinus problems. They get intense itching of their hands and feet, which is a neurological action, probably of the toluene on their nerves. Now we're starting to get into stuff which you really wouldn't want for your children when they're itching and fidgeting the whole time. Headaches and so on. But particulate matter from the diesel activity and from the fracking itself. Let's just take it up a notch. Radioactivity released into the air. We know that there's radioactivity under Rydale, parts of Rydale, especially in the north around Lockton and so on. 300,000 houses now in Pennsylvania, heavily fracked area, above the government maximum level for radiation within the house. It's the second commonest cause of lung cancer. And it relates to the distance you are from the wells. And the radioactivity within the well field, within the gas field, is 3 times higher than outside. So we know, we can guess, we can speculate that the radioactivity is coming from the fracking. Hard to prove, because it's hard to get your head under the ground and it's hard to get your head alongside the well to see where it's all coming from, but it relates strongly to the position of the wells. 60% of the frac pad work is overexposed to silica sand. Silica sand sounds nice and comfortable like beach sand, but it's fine. And it gets into the air, very fine dust, and you breathe it into your lungs. And it causes progressive scarring of the lungs, so you get progressive breathlessness. Can't treat it. And it increases your risk of TB. but worst of all, it gives you lung cancer. We've known about silicosis for decades, for millennia almost. It's been around, you can find evidence in the fossil record and so on. So 60% of the frack workers, why do we bother about the frack workers? Well, they're human beings, they're patients, they are young men usually who are in need of a job, and this is the easiest job that they can get. Nobody likes wearing respirators. Industry clearly don't insist on there being one, so their regulations aren't dealing with this, and in fact in America they try to up-regulate, in other words, increase the permissive level of frack sand. And then you've got the water. We know that water gets contaminated from spills, from leaks, or quite probably from the well itself. Wells leak, we know that, the industry accepts that. And when they start doing quite sophisticated assessments on the water quality, in Texas they find lead, arsenic, mercury and other heavy metals, benzene, all those BTEX chemicals, fracking solvents, things that aren't normally in your water. And these have a whole variety of effects. We know about mercury because that's what the Mad Hatter had. Mercury rots your brain. We know arsenic gives you cancer of the skin, but it can kill you in higher quantities. Heavy metals stick around, you don't wash them out of your body, you can't wash them out of the soil, and so on and so on. And then this little group at the bottom here, the endocrine disruptors, looking quite sad and lonely. These are small chemicals that behave like the controlling chemicals to your own hormone system, which is the fine control of the body. So that these endocrine disruptors can upset the regulation of your thyroid hormone. They can upset the regulation of your steroid, natural steroid production. And they can upset the regulation of your sex hormones, your reproductive hormones. So we have a problem there, which is very hard to deal with. So finally, let's just have a look at an area where I think some of those things you could say, well, okay, so a few children wheeze a bit more from their asthma getting worse. Okay, so a few smokers, their smoking lung gets worse. We're in a sacrifice zone. We're in a gas field. We are expected to put up with some sort of level of punishment so that we can get gas out. There have to be red lines. I have red lines, and here they are. And I don't like to be a scaremonger. I don't like to talk about stuff that I'm unsure about. Everything I've said so far has been referenced and looks extremely good. The Johns Hopkins survey is extremely good. It's from Johns Hopkins University Department of Public Health. It is absolutely gold standard public health department in America. And they looked very carefully at the distance from the wells, the activity from the wells, the number of wells, and the duration of exposure that pregnant women had. And they found that looking at those things, that women living close enough to active wells, there was a 40% increase in prematurity rates below 37 weeks. So they were more than 3 weeks born early. Now some of those babies would be getting into breathing distress. Some of them would be getting brain injuries. Some of them wouldn't survive. But when you start thinking about the impact of that sort of information, women living near fracking wells suffering pregnancy loss or pregnancy impacts, I think, from my taste, that's a red line. We want to know more. I'm not saying that's the last piece of research, and I'm not saying that there won't be more research, but this place I would rely on. There were 2 previous reports from Mackenzie in Colorado, and she found that there were impacts on preterm delivery, small babies, bad condition at birth, congenital heart defect, and spina bifida. Now that report's come in for some criticism. She's now 2 years into repeating that science. And that's what I like to see. Let's tune this up, have another look at it, and see if that research is true. But in the meantime, I'm not so happy about us going blundering forwards in a dash of gas. And I'll just mention, this is not peer-reviewed science. There was a Donnie Young, a midwife in a place called Vernal in northern Utah. Utah, the sort of place where you go horse riding and never see anybody. Pristine air quality until fracking came along. And now, because of something called temperature inversion, it's in a bowl. And in the winter time, the air doesn't escape and it sits in Utah. And air quality as bad as the worst days in Los Angeles. So she noticed one day, one of her mums went into labour, stillbirth. She'd never had in 20, 30 years of being a midwife a stillbirth. So she went to the funeral and noticed that there were 3 other graves, freshly dug graves, for babies, either stillborn or born shortly after death. And she thought that was very strange. So she went and had a look back in the graveyard. Previous year, 2 graves. Previous year, 1 grave. And through the rest of that year, 2013, there are a total of 13 graves in that graveyard. Vernal population 10,000. So that's like Malton and Norton, Pickering and a few villages chucked in. 1 in 15 graves were for newborns. And so she did what she should have done, which was she contacted her public health department, and after a year they said, well, we've looked at this whole area, rather like looking at Scarborough, Rydale, Hambleton, and yes, there's a bit of a blip, but it's not significant. This place, Vernal, now had a death rate 6 times the national average, referred to as a bit of a blip. So we've got John Hopkins and we've got that anecdotal story, but it's enough to make my ears prick up and say there's something going on. So living near fracking wells causes loss of physical and mental well-being. It causes lung, heart and neurological diseases, 27% kick up in admissions to hospital in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, when they started fracking. 27%. And a loss of community cohesion, so that communities start falling to pieces because somebody over there has rented out their land and getting a few quid in their back pocket. Somebody over here doesn't like their children going to school along the main road with all those lorries going past. Somebody over there, their wheezing gets worse. Somebody over here is worried about their water. And they're all trying to claim that small pot of money, and their house price has gone down, they can't sell their house. What was a tight community falls to pieces. It happens in America, it's difficult in Australia, it happens in Canada. Why are we going to be any different here?